and welcome to Planet Poetry. I'm Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. Today we're delving into the sometimes murky and mysterious world of poetry publishing. Robin talks to poet and academic JT Welsch about the business of poetry, how publishing works, and all that mysterious stuff.
And Peter and I are going to have a chat about some of the issues, reminding ourselves that publishing needn't be the ultimate goal for a poet. And we talk a bit about our own adventure with Telltale Press, don't we?
Yeah, that's when we try to seize the means of poetry production and create a revolution in poetry.
Well, we didn't just try, I think we did it. But anyway, so before we get our hands dirty talking business, Peter, do you think we should start with a poem or two?
Well, yes, here's one I prepared earlier. This is Guillaume Apollinaire. I always select the names of French people I struggle to pronounce. He was the first person that actually coined the term surrealism, which is pretty cool. And this poem has got a sort of disturbing, dreamlike clarity, and it kind of embodies for me that surrealism. It's also dedicated to, this is another name I always struggle with, to Chirico, who's that strange painter of empty, blasted landscapes and sort of empty squares with people running across them and so on. I'll just read the poem, I think. Ocean of Earth. I built a house in the middle of the ocean. Its windows are rivers which flow out of my eyes. Octopus stir all around its walls. Listen to the triple beat of their hearts and their beaks which tap on the window panes. Humid house, burning house, rapid season, season which sings. Airplanes drop eggs. Watch out for the anchor. Watch out for the ink which they squirt. It's a good thing you came from the sky. The honeysuckle of the sky climbs up. The earthly octopus throb. And then we are closer and closer to being our own grave diggers. Pale octopus of chalky waves. O octopus with pale beaks, around the house there is this ocean which you know and which is never still.
Goodness. I see what you mean about the surrealist angle. There's something about the word octopus I can't take seriously in a poem, which is terrible because they're fabulous creatures, aren't they? Very intelligent and deep.
I like this idea of just this kind of unsubtle metaphor of these octopus in a house at the bottom of the ocean. And just that sort of precision of the triple beat of their hearts, because I read a whole book about octopuses a while ago, and they have 3 hearts. And so it's that kind of little precision. For me, it's a kind of hauntingly original image of insecurity, of being beset by, weirdness, anxiety, octopuses, something without a human intelligence. It's like one of those dreams that you can remember vividly. And I often think about this poem, about the triple beat of these octopuses' hearts in this little house underwater, looking up at the sky.
Perhaps Lennon and McCartney read that poem before they wrote the famous song.
And the octopus's cut. Maybe this is a good time to hear Robin's interview with JT Welsch.
JT Welsch is a lecturer in English and Creative Industries at the University of York. He is the author of several books of poetry, and he co-edited with Agnes Lahosky an anthology, Wretched Strangers, Borders, Movement, Homes, published by Boiler House Press in 2018. In 2020, his monograph, The Selling and Self-Regulation of Contemporary Poetry, was published by Anthem Press. So, JT Welsch, welcome to the podcast. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This is a bit different because you are a poet, but we're not going to be asking you about your work as a poet. Sorry about that. But
that's fine.
It's this book, The Selling and Self-Regulation of Contemporary Poetry, that really caught my eye, because I think that's something a lot of us poets always want to know about. Tell us a bit about how you came to write this book.
First of all, I think that sense of having these different hats is very much part of it, because I am a poet, but I'm also an academic, and I teach things to do with publishing and kind of coming at it from a critical kind of research side of things. But it's sort of self-serving as well, because I want to have my own personal feelings about these things, and I want to know about how they work. And really, I guess over the past 10 or 12 years or so, I guess I've been, just noticing different kinds of things, like individually, different kinds of trends, different changes I've noticed, either with technologies or just the different ways that poets are working. And I'm just fascinated by that, really. And so just gradually, it was a very long period. It was kind of, some of the chapters in the book are nearly 10 years old. Hopefully don't show their age too much, but it's trying to map over time how those changes have come about.
And you talk a lot about the technology, and reading it, actually, I realized how much had happened in the last 20 years. It all seems to have been, it feels like it's happened in no time. But when you talk about what was going on 20 years ago, suddenly that seems like a heck of a long time ago.
Yeah.
And partly, of course, internet, self-publishing, people publishing online, etc. It's really made some big changes. And yet I feel as if traditional poetry publishing is still sort of going on as normal, or the same way. Would you say that was true?
Yeah, I agree. It feels sort of, on one hand, like quite overwhelming, I guess, the sense of things changing so quickly in so many ways that you're trying to keep up. But I think you're right that in other ways, there's a kind of, it's not superficial, but there's a kind of surface level where there's still this story of like poetry connecting us with longer traditions and ways of thinking and being in the world. And we don't want to lose that. In some ways, this research for me is just trying to get my own bearings and then figuring out, from that, what can we preserve? What do we want to preserve? And what might be good changes, possible, new possibilities?
I suppose one of the obvious examples is Insta poetry. And I was interested to read your take on that. I was hadn't really clocked at how the visual element, it sounds ridiculous, Instagram, it is visual, how the visual element is so much a part of it, and the presentation of the work in these photographic montages with the backgrounds are often pictures of torn pieces of paper and typewriters and old school, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? Linking poetry online with actually what it used to be like.
I find it just completely fascinating. I mean, I know it's a difficult thing. For a lot of poets, there's a knee-jerk sense that these people, these Insta poets or whatever terms we use to kind of denigrate them, that this isn't serious poetry. This is just kind of playing to social media, kind of influencer culture. But I think some of the things that they're doing, we are starting to see that trickle into poetry more generally, whether knowingly or kind of unconsciously. A lot of these poets, people like, Rupi Kaur and others, are being published by different kinds of publishers who had no experience publishing poetry, so they were making up as they go along as well. So you go into big bookshops now and you just see loads of these books. They are selling and they look different. They're full of images, they're full of different colors and kinds of things. I think we'll just continue to see more and more of that.
Did you say actually that the publisher who's brought out Rupi Kaur's books actually has a history of comic strip type books?
It's Andrews McMeel Publishing. And they publish a lot of the big names, Lang Leave and a bunch of others. They do gift books. They do books that look nice and you give to someone, or it sits in your loo or wherever. A long history of that with comics and stuff. So they have a different sensibility. And I think the thing that happens is when you quote Rupi Kaur or someone out of context and you're just taking the words, it is slightly unfair. Whatever we think of the work, that's not really how it was intended to be read.
Interesting. So, and I think also perhaps you referred at one point to visuals coming into more, shall we say, serious, is that the word? Poets. The fact that there have been books like Anne Carson's Knox, Claudia Rankine, Citizen collections. Now we're seeing more imagery, more photos, more artifacts. So I suppose there's been like a feedback back and forth, cross-fertilization maybe in that sense.
I think so. partly for technological reasons. Like the internet is just very visually oriented. I think that's why poetry works well online, because even if it is just text, a poem looks like something visually that, you can't really just post a novel. You can't tweet a screen shot of a novel in the same way. But also, this is a time where they're crossing the streams between different art forms. So lots of poets in the UK who have come through art school backgrounds, or, in North America as well, people like Claudia Rankine who are interested in video art and image collage and different things. And it's, those things working together, and with printing technologies, which I guess a lot of people don't think about, but it's much cheaper to print books in color with images and things than it used to be. It used to be very prohibitive. So
yeah. And self-publishing, in fact, of course, is the same thing in that it's a lot cheaper to do now and to do well. On the subject of poetry as content, I was also struck by, I think, was it Nicholas Carr? You gave an example that he gave an example of, if you think about people posting their poetry on the internet, on Facebook or whatever, or Instagram, it's a bit like the landowners after the American Civil War, divvying up the land and giving people their little plots, the sharecropping analogy, and that if you are you're happy just to post your stuff on your Instagram site or whatever, you are in an attention economy, whereas the owners of the platform are in a cash economy. And you can quite happily enjoy the social benefits of doing what you're doing without worrying about whether or not someone's selling adverts off the back of your content. I thought that was really interesting discussion. I mean, do you think people are really aware of that situation, or are we complicit in it?
I think, I love that metaphor as well. I find it really striking because I think we're all aware of these things. Like, at this point, we know the media is full of stories about all these big tech companies not paying their taxes or doing different dodgy things. And we're all critical of them in lots of ways. At the same time, at the day-to-day level, posting stuff on these platforms, it doesn't feel like we're participating in that economic system in quite a direct way. It feels like we're making decisions about the time and the effort that we put into it. And we're able to rationalize that time and effort, and you kind of say, well, I'm sort of investing this time in self-promotion or building my website or posting on social media. And I'm going, the rewards of that will be invitations to do readings or maybe publications or different kinds of things. But it's what we're doing there is economic. It's just, even if there's not money being passed around, we're thinking in those kinds of terms. And so I think that metaphor of sharecropping reminds us to kind of look out for ourselves. And they used to always say, right, with poetry, if you're ever paying for it, you want to make sure the money is flowing in the right direction, that it should be towards the writer. It's a similar kind of thing. You don't want people to be taken advantage of. It's just that it's not the same where you used to get, a vanity publisher would kind of say, oh, for this amount of money, you can have your poetry book.
Yeah.
It's similar, but it's
in the background.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, does it matter? Actually, a lot of people say, well, actually, I don't really care about that, because actually what I'm doing, I'm sharing, I'm enjoying, I have a community. That's it for me. Like you said, that's an alternative form of economy, I suppose.
I think that is changing. I don't know if that's your sense as well, is that 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of debate about self-promotion, like on Twitter, and whether that was tactless to kind of constantly be retweeting when you had good reviews. We've kind of gotten over that. And
bragging.
Yeah. The humble brag and all the kind of shameless plug. People always use these terms. And
are we over that? In what sense? In what sense are we over it?
I think it's been, to use another buzzword, it's been kind of normalized, I think, that sort of self-promotion. And that cuts both ways. I guess it can be a good thing because we can make our own decisions. We can rationalize without feeling like there's a stigma. In other ways, I think there are people, I certainly have students where they feel like that's just part of the job now. And if you want to be any kind of writer, you're going to have to learn how to do all this self-promotion. And that can exclude people.
Yeah. Well, let's turn the attention onto prizes now, if we can. Peter and I had a lovely chat over a few beers about prizes, for and against, but we were talking really about poetry competitions as opposed to the big prizes for the collections. But you have a very interesting chapter in the book where you talk about prize culture. You give that example from was it 2014, where Paxman was on the board of judges for the Forwards or something, and he made some comment like poets are only talking to one another and it's all irrelevant. Basically, I think that's a bit of a paraphrase, I think. But the fact that was released kind of at the same time as the shortlist, like it had the blessing of the organisers. You make the point that actually the creation of these so-called scandals is part of the commentary that goes around prizes, which in turn is what gives them their value. I'm interested to have you explain that a bit more for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of things are going on here. And I know sometimes it gets that question of, should we just get rid of all prizes? I don't think they're going anywhere. So it's thinking about, again, how they're sort of changing, because some of these prizes have been around a long time, but in this era of, I would describe it as participatory media, that it isn't just, what are the newspapers saying, but what are we all saying and they're responding to and reporting. Things like scandals, that gets a lot of traction, right? Whether it is a storm in a teacup or whether it's a genuine debate, a comment like Paxman's or any other kinds of scandals, they go a long way for raising awareness for the prize, and they bring attention to it. And then everybody wants to know then who's going to win and whether that person deserved it. And maybe they'll buy more books. I think it will be hard to trace the exact stuff. My way I got my head around it in the book was thinking about it is in terms of like that participation, and thinking about these kind of shares as a kind of pun of like the sharing that we do on social media, but that we're almost sort of like buying stock in these scandals when we weigh in with our own opinions and commentary. It is about community, but it's kind of, if you comment on something and then that gets retweeted and then the Guardian writes it up and they quote your tweet, there's a lot of cultural capital going around in those conversations. And I think it's only natural that we all want part of that.
Yeah,
prizes are always a real point for that. They help structure those conversations, right?
Yeah, carry on criticizing the prizes because it helps keep them going.
Yeah,
I think. Someone like Jeremy Paxman, it's no skin off his nose, but there have been some scandals, haven't there? There have been quite bruising, that have kind of been unpleasant to witness. But I suppose what you're saying is that we live in a neoliberal society, as you've mentioned, as you point out, and therefore that is the name of the game, if you like. Is there always going to be competition as well as community and poetry? Yeah. People say, oh, well, people point out all these arguments that go on in the poetry world. And then others will say, well, there's no more than any other world. It's only because it's poetry. And outsiders think that we all love each other and there's no, we should be above competition. But is that ridiculous?
That's the way when people kind of say, oh, it's not a horse race. We just don't need these things. And some days I do feel like that, but I think that they can be productive for these conversations. I mean, you look at things like questions about diversity in poetry. A shortlist is a very useful tool for that because it's very visible, and a prize shortlist comes out and we can look at that and we can see what kinds of people are included. We can all do the quick maths in our head and kind of see, or people who just come up again and again and again. You look at the past 10 years and the big prizes in the UK, that's been a point where that conversation has moved things forward, and the lists are more inclusive in lots of different ways.
You make the point also about the love of the debut collection, and a lot more debuts have won prizes, younger poets, whereas perhaps they were underrepresented, in the 20th century in the prize list or whatever. So I guess that's another way of redressing the balance.
It is. I think debuts are tricky. And I think some of the conversations about age requirements on prizes that's been a good conversation, because it's helped us separate that assumption that a debut poet will always be in their early 20s and kind of, just bursting onto the scene in this way. And that, I think that's been important. In the long run, it's hard to say whether the recent debuts winning so many prizes and a lot of publishers just putting out a lot more debuts than they did 10 years ago, will they be able to support them over the longer career? I think is a crucial question, because I think there are people, I guess, who, however you describe them, sort of mid-list, mid-career poets, where they were once described as emerging, and do they feel like they've emerged? If there are resources that are specifically for debut writers, that is important, but we can't forget those other people where it's suddenly you're not eligible for those specific debut prizes or funding anymore, and that's that's tough. We want people to develop.
Yeah, but some might also say that people can emerge at any age. So there's the late emergers.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the way we talk about these things, we're getting a little more precise.
I think one example of that would be like the new and the next generation lists, where the most recent one had people of lots of different ages. There's a question there of whether generation is the right word anymore, but that's good.
I must make it sound like there's a lot of negativity. I'm sort of bringing up all these kind of negative things like competition and prizes, but there's a lot of positivity I took from this. And you talk about how you picked up on the book by Joe Bell and Jane Kamain, How to Be a Poet, and some of the kind of terminology they use in terms of here's what you do, and then you share with your community, and it's kind of more an inclusive, they have this kind of inclusive attitude, and maybe that's a way forward. And also this word ecology comes up later. You discuss how that's been used by quite a few people to talk about the poetry world rather than the poetry business or whatever, the ecology that we're in. What do you think sitting behind that terminology?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it comes up everywhere. And there are some times when it's used, I don't know, by a government minister, and it feels like it's a really cynical kind of metaphor. They're talking about some kind of ecology, and they really mean economy. They really mean, a business structure. I think when it comes to poetry, I think it's just like you said there, it feels like everybody will have their either positive or negative take on these changes. My own feeling is that we need to come to terms with them at the very least. I don't think it helps to kind of wish, I wish it were back like it used to be, because that's not how these changes seem. But I think books like a few different books actually that Nine Arches Press have published now, they show this way of thinking about craft alongside these other kinds of skills that poets are expected to develop. And I think, as I said, I think there's a balance there. I really hate it when students who are brilliant writers feel suddenly like there's this whole other thing, this business side of things that they need to bone up on, and all these skills, and that would put them off. But I think on the other hand, it's good then that we educate and we make these kinds of skills accessible. And so whether it's books like that or just having a conversation where we can say, look, there is a certain amount of skill to self-promotion. There is a certain amount of skill to giving a reading or to giving an interview or setting up events and networking, and admit that not everybody just has those skills naturally. Some people might, some people are very confident and, just right out of the gate, they're going to change the world. I envy those people. I don't naturally feel like that. I've needed someone to kind of say, this is how you write a cover letter, or this is the right time that you should start approaching publishers. So I think it's good on the whole that we're having these conversations, even if that leads to kind of some debates about the best ways forward. We don't have to go all in, but I do think we should keep talking about these changes. And yeah, so a word like ecology, maybe, there's something in that. We can think about if there are more positive, life-affirming or planet-affirming ways that we can do business in poetry.
I like the idea of a sort of an ecology of like a kind of an ocean, who are the plankton in this ocean, who are the bottom feeders, and
who are the sharks. Yeah.
So what do you think about self-publishing? I have to ask you this, generally speaking, that it used to be self-publishing before the internet, before the last 20 years, I suppose it was like you'd pay someone or you'd, put your thing together, desktop publishing, and it would be a print thing. But of course, self-publishing actually is what anyone does when they post a poem on the internet now. It doesn't have to be a print collection, but there used to be a big kind of taboo, didn't there, on that whole issue? Have you got any?
I think that's changing. I mean, that's my own sense. I guess I would admit my bias here, because I've self-published a few things, and I run a letter press, very old-fashioned kind of hand printing old technology at the University of York. And I'm printing a book of my own at the moment, and I have control over everything, and I can do all kinds of things that another publisher would never let me do, have different colors on the page and do things. And that feels like a whole work of art that I'm involved in doing that. And I think we're starting to see more of that. I think poets, especially now, again, it's cheap and the technology is there. There's printing on demand, and I hope that becomes more of a trend. I think that is a positive thing. I think there will be things, like you said, that kind of that general feeling. Prizes are usually a bit slower to kind of recognize self-publishing, so it feels like they're not legitimate quite in that way. But
yeah, and I mean, the Poetry Library used to say, you know, we won't take your book if it's self-published. But a few years ago, when Peter and I were involved in a publishing collective, Telltale Press, we got them to accept our pamphlets. So that felt like a little bit of a bit of an acknowledgement. But I'm totally with you on this. I think it's great. And some of the things that are being done.
I mean, I guess my overall feeling about it is that where it used to be quite a hard line between being published by a big major publisher, and then if you didn't get into those, then your only route was maybe self-publishing. Now we've got this whole spectrum of all these micro presses and small presses and indie presses. And it really blurs that line. You know, if you've got a friend who runs a tiny little press and you work closely with them to make a book like you want, like, is that self-publishing, or it's kind of and that's a good thing.
Perhaps we need some new prizes for self-published books, maybe, or something like that, or handmade books. You know, there's that lovely coast to coast to coast little magazine that Maria Isakova Bennett is doing, you know, out of Liverpool. Yeah. There are some really nice things going on. Yeah. Almost feel that those sorts of things should be somehow be recognised. But
the resurgence of like zine culture and kind of like
zine culture, well, you know, just people, absolutely, totally.
That's you know, and if you know, it doesn't have to just be, I guess, self-publishing. If it implies a kind of narcissism and you're just going it alone, actually, it can be very communal.
Yeah, and I think this has been helped by the Instagram type phenomenon. I think there is an audience for Instagram poetry. Maybe we should just consider that there are lots of different audiences for poetry, and try and get away from the value judgments. I'm trying to talk myself into this now. I'm not sure I'm convinced.
Well, I don't. If it helps, like I guess another way I think of it is that there's so many people making lots of different kinds of content online now. I mean, you think of performance poets and like brilliant videos and different platforms that they're using. Like that doesn't, you know, we wouldn't call that self-producing. We wouldn't kind of cordon it off in a particular category. Everybody's just doing this creative stuff. So why shouldn't they make books?
Yeah.
You mentioned at the start this question about poets as entrepreneurs, and I, in some ways, I don't know if other people can see really obviously from the book that it's just something I'm really grappling with as well. And like one chapter will swing one way and be like, this is awful, we need to resist this language. And then the other one will be like, well, maybe there's good sides of it. Is that something that you identify with?
Yeah. For me, you know, I come from a marketing background. So, but having said that, I hate humble bragging and stuff like that. You know, I'm rubbish at promoting myself in that way. We're now getting straight into poetry as a business for an individual, and that's tricky. I think what you said before was about right. You can be a poet and you can learn the necessary skills for helping to get your work out there, and who knows, maybe even sell it. There's certainly this question of publishers, what they do for the individual poets varies a huge amount, doesn't it? And I've come to realise that you can be published by a poetry publisher, and as soon as you get that deal, it's like, oh wow, I'm going to be part of their stable, it's going to be fantastic. And and the temptation for a lot of people, I think, is sit back and say, right, they're going to do all the marketing and everything, it's going to be fantastic. And then you realise actually sometimes they do nothing, not one thing apart from produce the book. And it's totally up to you. And so then you have to be an entrepreneur, I think. What's your feeling?
The thing I always keep reminding myself is, like, at the end of the day, like, poetry is so much smaller in terms of its scale than other kinds of content that's out there, right? I mean, it's like even within publishing, compared to commercial fiction or even big popular literary fiction, it's just on a totally different level. And so the amount of money that publishers are working with, or certainly the amount of money that individual poets, you know, the concrete resources are totally different.
It's a tricky one. Do you have students who feel they are going to make a career out of poetry, either writing it or teaching it or a bit of both?
I think as soon as they do, I'm very wary, and I want to make sure they understand, just what we were saying, that it's not a thing very many people are able to make a full-time living at. But the line between being a professional poet and a kind of amateur poet, I think that kind of distinction is very blurry as well. And there are lots of different kinds of careers in the arts or in the creative industries where people are involved with poetry probably more than there ever were before. And so that seems like a good thing. I want them to understand that in some ways the questions of getting published and developing their craft are very separate from those more practical questions of how you're going to make a living.
Yeah.
Poetry is like, there are so many worse things you could do with your time, right? And if anybody, I would never want to discourage anybody from dedicating however much of their life to thinking about language and thinking about readers and communicating with people and communities in that way. So, I mean, I think there are so many poets now who also work in marketing, which I find completely fascinating, like what that crossover is and whether it's a day job or whether it's something that feeds into your ways of thinking about language.
The people I know who've come from marketing background or who are in it are wordsmiths in a way. You know, if you love language and you work with language, and if you write marketing copy, then you can write poetry. Perhaps the other way around. I could start saying things like, well, as a marketer, you learn how to manipulate people's feelings.
But that's what poets do. That's what we're the master manipulators. Yeah, that's what we want.
That's right. Yeah. That's true. We could get to do it without having to sell any damn crisps or anything.
Yeah, just selling ourselves. Yeah.
I didn't ask you what you're working on now. Is there another book in the pipeline or poetry maybe?
Yes, I am trying to print by hand a book of poetry. But yeah, somebody already suggested that this book will need an update for poetry during COVID, because everything I was talking about seems to have changed again.
Oh, not everything. Well,
we'll see. I think the changes may have speeded up in some ways.
So it's been fascinating talking with you, JT. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Take care.
So, mea culpa, what JT was saying about working in marketing, we've both done that, haven't we? We're both guilty of this.
Yes, that's true.
Do you think there was anything from working in marketing that genuinely translates into being a poet?
Well, yes, I wasn't joking when I said marketers learn how to manipulate people's feelings and behaviour with words, because that surely is. I mean, you're more of an actual marketing copywriter than I am, so what's your take on that?
I think the best thing, because I write other stuff other than poetry, but the best thing about it was the idea of having to go to work every day, sit down, and whatever mood you're in or however hungover you are or whatever, you've just got to produce stuff. And I think it's quite good for that sense of discipline, because I always sit down every day and write stuff. It makes it less precious, this idea that you have to wait for the moment and kind of wander around looking at daffodils and so on. Actually, just get to your desk and get on with it, is my motto.
That's interesting. I that didn't occur to me in terms of my job as a marketer, I suppose. But I do relate to that in terms of other writing. When I was writing the blogging books, I had a brief and just get on with it and not stress about every single word before I submitted it. And I think you've also talked about giving yourself a brief.
Yeah, no, certainly with a play or something, that when I'm writing those, having a very clear idea of what you want to do. I mean, you don't know all the conversation and words and stuff that are going to happen inside it. But I like to have constraints as well. I'm talking about plays now, but, knowing that you have, say, 3 actors and what kind of space you need to fill and what sort of time you're going to work to and what sort of genre you're going to do, all those kind of things nailed down before you start. That makes the job of writing much easier. And maybe that's because of writing commercially, that knowing what the situation is beforehand is quite liberating.
Yeah. I do like constraints. Maybe that's why I'm not so productive on the poetry front, because I just think, well, the possibilities are endless. I could do this. I could riff off of this set of poems. I could develop this theme. There's so many things I could do, so I don't do any of them. Why do we need goals anyway? Why do we need deadlines? And, we should just write for the sake of, JT, we were talking about publishing. So what about, there are plenty of poets who have no interest in publishing. They are interested in writing, in the craft, in the activity itself, what they get from it. They might want to share their poetry, but some don't. And the idea of the whole publishing game does not appeal.
Yeah, I kind of instinctively don't want to treat poetry like business, because it's something I love, and I love the fact that it's the poets I love most are not really seeking our attention. They're just kind of writing brilliantly.
You've been able to read their work, therefore they must have shared it in some way. So if one doesn't want to share one's work, that's perfectly legitimate. But I think personally, I like to see my poems in print. That's just me. But plenty of people are not interested in that. Isn't that true?
I love seeing my work in print just because, ultimately, even though poetry is quite a private art, we're trying to talk to other people. It was interesting what JT said about quoting Jeremy Paxman saying that, poets are only talking to each other. His take on it was good as well about while it was quite an inflammatory thing to say, at least it created a debate,
And it was deliberately put out at the same time as the shortlist. So you might say more cynically, it was a marketing ploy, which is a part of creating excitement and selling books. Because as soon as you enter into this publishing arena, you are entering into business, aren't you? I thought it was interesting, actually, what he highlighted the fact that poetry is such a small fish in the publishing pond, such a small fish. So why would a publisher put a great deal of resources behind poetry books? And put that way, sort of think, well, I can see why not.
Well, I just think any publisher of poetry is a bit of a hero, really, because if you look at publishing more broadly, the publishers have become so risk averse lately. They're not even funding their sort of middleweight writers, as it were, or funding development.
Yeah.
It's extremely hard to be published by a mainstream publisher these days. Smaller presses have stepped into that breach. Poetry presses are so badly funded and the returns are so poor. That's why, there is this blurring of self-publishing and, all the other kind of flowerings that JT was talking about, like, Insta poets and all the rest of it. We have to be innovative. And I think that's quite exciting. And I quite like the idea of a different generation of poets having work that's published in a more graphical style and making it more accessible, because a new generation of poets and poetry lovers has got to emerge from somewhere, and just because it's packaged differently doesn't make that bad.
I agree, small presses are the heroes. And I need to just clarify a comment that I made in the interview, which was that some publishers won't do anything to help promote your book once it's published. I need to just say I'm not including in that Live Canon, who published one of my pamphlets, and they basically have been amazing. I think it is quite unusual to have that amount of teamwork, if you like, between poet and publisher. I'm not just talking about my own experience, it's talking to poets who've had books published with various presses. And I think if one's going into this wanting to have a collection published, it's good to know that in advance. If you know it in advance, as in this is teamwork, but you are a part of the team that's got to help put the book out there in order to promote sales, in order to help this tiny, tiny press who has taken a punt on publishing you. And that whole kind of ecosystem in the publishing world, I think, isn't articulated enough in my mind.
It's like poets that never subscribe to any magazines. You have to, there may be financial reasons for that, but there are a lot of people who, in poetry, who give their time for love and not money.
Absolutely.
And if you're able to feed back to that by buying books and, showing them a bit of love back, the poetry environment, in the UK at least, is good to continue to thrive. You and I have been to those small press fairs, haven't we? The poetry
Free Verse.
Yeah, we've visited Free Verse several times, and it's so exciting to walk around and see all the dedication and the innovation and people just working so hard.
It really is, yes. And a number of very small presses. They don't have a web presence. They don't do anything like that. And then you see what they're doing in the flesh. And as you say, they're labours of love, and a lot of them are one-man or one-woman bands. And it's incredible. And the energy in the room, the Poetry Book Fair, recommend it to anyone who's not been, who can get to London when the next one's on, because you're right, you would just walk around and it's just amazing. It's fantastic.
And all the readings and stuff.
Yeah.
What I like about that stuff is, somebody that writes and loves poetry is that suddenly you feel amongst your tribe, it's
right.
okay, you're not a weirdo. But actually there's loads of other people that like doing this stuff too. And that's a nice feeling.
It is. And I think that, again, to go back to the idea of publishing or not publishing, I think there are ways to be creative and do your own thing and bring out your own micro publication, or do 20 limited edition, 20 handmade thingy bobs.
Yeah.
There's so many different ways of exposing your work to the world, I think, rather than hankering after what seem to be the big glamorous outlets. Says she, who not so many years ago, I used to sort of dream of, well, now what font size would get my name fitting on the front of a Faber pamphlet?
Yeah. I was shortlisted for a Faber introductory thing when I was about 30. And I didn't quite make the cut. And the whole process took about 2 years of being rejected. So that was very disappointing when I wasn't, having allowed all my kind of uncontrollable fantasies to take over.
What a shame. That would have been a whole different trajectory for PK.
Yeah, I'd like to think that the successful Peter Kinney would be in a bar drinking absinthe and kind of half dead by now, whereas I'm in robust health.
Or marking student essays.
Well, I think the gods laugh at ambitions of poets, don't they?
Yeah. You and I, Peter, we co-founded a poets publishing collective, didn't we? Telltale Press.
Yeah, we dipped our toes into the publishing world.
I think our idea was that, yes, we wanted to just take back control. I can't say that. We just wanted to take some kind of responsibility rather than sort of sitting back and thinking, oh, I'd really nice to have a pamphlet published or whatever. And we wanted to have creative control, I think, in all ways, didn't we, over how the thing would look.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do it with other poets. This was the dream, that we would all share all the jobs involved, and we would all learn about all the things that we needed to do to publish our pamphlets. We had this ideal, didn't we, of how we were going to do it.
About poets seizing the means of production, wasn't it? There was a kind of sort of Marxist undertone to
that was the slogan, seizing the means of poetry production. And we also held a lot of readings, didn't we? I mean, I'm really proud of what we did in the 4 or 5 years that Telltale Press ran its course.
But there's something just about being proactive and not waiting. I'm terrible at waiting for things to happen.
Yes.
I'd much rather be positive and proactive about something. You're the same, and maybe that's why we're doing the podcast now.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think if you come to something with positive energy, it can only spread. We would recommend that to any groups of poets listening who are thinking, get together with someone like-minded at the similar stage of your poetry development. If you're feeling frustrated about not getting published, I think it's a really positive way of self-publishing. And the stigma of self-publishing, well, JT seemed to feel that it was lessening, didn't he? That now that there's so many more ways to enter the publishing arena.
I remember being published in Canada one time. The poems were wrapped up in scrolls, and it was like a box of chocolates, and you open the box and there's all these scrolled poems in there. I think they were called espresso publishing.
Well, they were all kind of loose in the box, these scrolls.
They're all laid on their sides, like a load of flakes or something in a box. Not that happens,
okay.
I remember seeing that, and this was like donkey's years ago, but I'm thinking, why not be more innovative about the way that you reach people? And that was like and there's this what's that publisher that does kind of poetry booklets, almost like cards?
Oh, yes, Candlestick Press, is it? You think
Candlestick Press, yeah. I mean, just ways of reframing. I mean, the work they feature is always really good work, but it's just reframing how you present the work to people. Why not do that? Why not think laterally and be creative? Your creativity shouldn't just stay on the page.
No. Talking about innovative forms, I really enjoyed that Anne Carson book, Knox. Did you ever see that?
Oh, yes.
In its format?
No, I didn't. It's like a prose poem, isn't it?
I'm thinking more of the format. So it comes in a box. I mean, it's the size of a concise English dictionary. It's a big box, and you open it up, and the whole book, if you like, is actually a concertina. So it concertinas out. So instead of turning the page, you just open up the concertina a bit more. You pull it out, and then you have to put the bits you've read to the side, and it becomes like this slinky.
Oh, nice.
In some ways, it's unwieldy and it's a bit extreme, but I really enjoyed it. I liked the form, and I liked the idea of it, that it unfolded. I think the whole thing was a facsimile of what was originally a scrapbook.
Oh, cool, yeah.
There were all kinds of things about it that intrigued me, and they were all to do with the form, but the poetry was still powerful and good and interesting. You wanted to keep reading. I'd love to produce something like that. Completely uncommercial and ridiculous, but lovely. Anne Carson gets away with it.
Robin, let's finish with a poem, something uplifting and cheerful. Have you got something up your sleeve?
Something uplifting and cheerful. Well, I was thinking of poems to do with publishing, as in, is there some kind of ars poetica of the publishing side of things?
Is there I can't think of any poem like that. Where have you got this? Where is this volume?
It's not strictly speaking to do with publishing, but it's about poetry competitions, which isn't far off the mark, is it? And it's very short. And this poem was in the North, and it's by Meg Cox. Meg has been widely published, and whenever I see her work, invariably it makes me smile. But I mustn't make it sound like she only writes funny poems. That's not true at all. But I know she does perform as well, so this is probably one of those that she whips out for a bit of a laugh at a reading. It's called My Friend, the Prize-Winning Poet. Of course, I had to say I was delighted for her. In fact, be the first of us to say it. I didn't think it necessary to mention that I too had entered the competition. Of course, I smiled and said I loved one particular line in her winning poem. The last is a pretty safe bet, but I hadn't actually read it, and I won't be fucking reading it either. Apologies for no warning of swearage.
Was that the end of the poem? That was brilliant. Weirdly, I don't think there's anybody writing poetry in the country that can't identify with that poem.
And I love the way it slipped into the North. You're reading the North, a fine publication, and suddenly this poem kind of comes in and makes you laugh out loud over your cup of tea. I love that.
Meg Cox, well done, Meg.